All right. It is 3 o'clock, and I am Lee Thurburn, and I'm here to um, share information. That is my goal, is to share information. Today is Thursday, February 25th, and on Tuesdays and Thursdays, we talk about strategy and building a competitive advantage. So today's our very first day to talk on these subjects, and I want to start off by sharing a well-known quote that I think is great, which is a quote that Chuck Noll, the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers back in their glory days, stated, "If you want to win, do the ordinary things better than anyone else does them, day in and day out." And that, generally speaking, is great advice. Now we're going to come back to that because, quite honestly, that is not sufficient in the world of business to build a competitive advantage that allows your company to be really, truly successful. It's a good place to start, but it's not enough. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about competitive advantage and strategy, but first I want to do a few definitions and kind of set the tone of the conversation, let you know what we're going to talk about. Strategy, competitive advantage building, is a topic that you can spend a lifetime studying. And I don't know that anybody ever is finished, regardless of how good they are at strategy building. So, but first, let's talk about strategy, what it is. It's the ideas, decisions, and actions that enable a company to succeed. Really, it's about competitive advantage. So, while strategy is important, strategy is really tied to competitive advantage. And it's important for us to have a really good understanding of what a competitive advantage is. Now, you're going to see a lot of definitions and a lot of textbooks, and a lot of people are going to talk about competitive advantage. And it usually is boiled down to a simple statement of you do something better than any other company does. And that's not enough. That's just not a sufficiently good description of what a competitive advantage is. The thing that you do has to not only be better than them and more difficult for them to copy or to emulate or to respond to. Basically, they can't figure out a way to come back and offer a better alternative, right? But that's not enough. It has to also attract customers. And so in the clearest, simplest way that I think you can define it, a competitive advantage is something that you do that's difficult for other companies to respond to or to copy, and it attracts customers. Those are sort of two critical concepts regarding competitive advantage. And if a company doesn't have a competitive advantage, it doesn't have a reason for another, for a customer to come and do business with them. So as I get warmed up and get going here, if you can hear me, and if you're out there kind of tuned in, give me a chat and post a comment and just let me know, because I'm still kind of new at this live broadcast game. So, if you're tuned in, just shoot a chat at me and let me know. But I'm going to go back to the concept of competitive advantage and strategy now, and carry our conversation to the next step. And the next step is to focus on the concept of strategic management. And again, every aspect of why you focus on strategy is to help your company build a significant and sustainable competitive advantage. There are lots of companies, there's lots of people out there that are in business that have a competitive advantage, but it's fleeting. It's not significant. It's not long lasting. I personally have an experience I can share with you on that. And this relates to back around the year 2000 when I became a Quiznos franchisee. Now, in 2000, when I bought my Quiznos licenses, Quiznos was the only sub-sandwich vendor company out there that made a toasted sandwich. And, my partner in this, my brother-in-law and I did some research, and we thought, wrongly, we thought that a toasted sandwich would be a difficult thing for other companies, particularly Subway, to put into place. We did a lot of research on Quiznos. We went to a lot of them. We talked to a lot of people, and we saw how Quiznos made their sandwiches. And they had this big oven that would pull the sandwich through on an assembly line. And we thought this is going to be really tough for Subway to figure out how to compete with. So since Subway was really the only major sub sandwich company out there, we thought that Quiznos had a significant competitive advantage. And they did for a couple of years, because it took 2 or 3 years before Subway figured out how to respond. Ultimately, Subway, as you now know, figured out how to put in place a very quick, super fast sandwich toasting oven. And they now, and for a long time now, they offer toasted sandwiches. Quiznos' competitive advantage was short-lived. We didn't think about it in terms of how different, we just, bottom line is we didn't realize how fleeting that competitive advantage would be. So now you have all kinds of sandwich shops. You have Potbellies and Jimmy John's and just a whole bunch of toasted sub sandwich shops out there. In fact, toasting your sub sandwich is just an option that pretty much everybody has. So that's an example of a competitive advantage that was temporary, that was fleeting, that might have been significant. And I think at the time it was significant because they were the only one I could find that had a toasted sub sandwich. But it wasn't a sustainable, long-term sustainable competitive advantage. So when you focus on the concept of competitive advantage, you want to focus on building not just a competitive advantage, but one that is significant and sustainable for a long time frame. Now, there's almost nothing that you can do in the world of business that is going to be a permanent fix. You're almost always going to have to do things to continue to buttress and support the advantage that you have. We'll come back to that later. I want to talk about the concept of strategic management and what that is. It's a process. It's a never-ending process, and it has multiple steps in it. And you can find all kinds of information about how to develop a strategy in the strategic management process. They almost all boil down to something very similar to what I have on screen here. And this is, in my situation, I've got it as a 4-step repeat, so 5-step process. But first, strategic management involves, at the first stage, analyzing and evaluating a whole variety of variables. Then, after you've done your research and analysis and evaluated the situation, you draw up a list of actions that you can implement, and you make decisions on the things that you can do. You formulate a strategy. You look at all the different strategic options that you have. So you make decisions and formulate ideas on how you're going to take action. And then you implement actions. So analyze and evaluate, decide and formulate, and implement actions. Now, the next step is critically important, and that's measurement. I like to say that management and measurement are really two words that are almost mirror images of each other, because management is all about measurement. Every aspect of what you do as a manager of your business involves measurement, because if you don't measure the results of your actions, you're not going to know whether or not your actions had a beneficial impact. So management is measurement. So strategic management cannot be concluded unless you have a way of measuring the results of the strategic actions that you've implemented. And then, of course, you repeat the process, because you're in an ever-changing environment. The competition in the world doesn't stop. And you need to be able to pivot as the environment changes. So you just repeat the process over and over. And so strategic management and strategy formulation is a never-ending process. Over the course of the next weeks and months, we're going to talk about a lot of things. We're going to talk about building a competitive advantage and strategy, and dive down. Now, I've got a little list here on screen of the things that we're going to talk about, and we're going to actually dive pretty deeply into each one of these. We'll start by talking about the internal environment and the external environment, intellectual assets, competitive advantage, formulation, business level strategy, corporate level strategy, international strategies, entrepreneurial strategies, corporate governance, corporate structure, culture, leadership ethics, organizational learning, innovation, and corporate entrepreneurship. That's a lot. We're not going to cover that in a few days. And so as we go along, we're going to look much deeper into each one of these things, and basically help you be capable of coming up with a way of analyzing for your company, your situation, all the different things that impact formulation of strategy, and help you improve the strategies that you come up with. When you look at the first step, the analysis and evaluation, and look a little deeper, what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about things like vision and mission and goals and objectives. And you see on screen what we're going to talk about. Vision and mission are important because vision and mission are how you communicate both to the world at large and to your staff why you're doing what you're doing. And if you're lucky, you feel pulled by a purpose and a passion for a particular thing. But that's hard to motivate a company. That can motivate an entrepreneur. It can motivate the founders of a company. But passion and purpose don't really translate well into actionable steps for a large organization. And unless you just plan to be a chuck in a truck type of business where you do everything, you're going to need to have people understand why you do what you do. I think of it as the Iditarod dog sled sort of paradigm. You know, the dogs that pull the dog sleds and the Iditarod challenge up in Alaska, they all have to pull in the same direction. And if they don't pull in the same direction, then the sled doesn't go where it needs to go as fast as it could go. And a business is not really much different. So vision and mission, goals and objectives serve the function of helping the people in your organization pull in the right direction to accomplish the goals that you have. Again, if you're chucking a truck and you only have one employee, or maybe just yourself or a half dozen employees, you probably don't really think you need mission and vision and goals and objectives. They seem to be superfluous, and actually they might be. But without them, you're very rarely going to have the opportunity to actually build a big company. Now, it may not be your goal. That may not be what drives you. That may not be, what you see as the end game in your business. And that's okay. Not everybody needs to have 100,000 employees, and you can be a success in, many different ways. But, if you have a vision or goal for your economic activity to be significant, then you're going to need to have a clear understanding of your vision and your mission and your goals and of your objectives. Then we're going to look at the internal and the external environment of the company. Generally speaking, we're going to analyze the strengths and weaknesses and the opportunities and threats that exist outside of the company. But it's not that simple. It's not just a SWOT analysis. We're going to be looking at a lot of additional things. We're going to be looking at the resources that the company has access to and the value chain activities that it's involved in. We're going to be talking a lot about all the different steps in the process of creation of value that the company does. And this will apply to companies, whether you're manufacturing or construction or retail or wholesale or distribution or service. All of these kinds of companies have value chains and resources and constraints, strengths, weaknesses, and they live in an environment that has a constantly changing set of threats as well as opportunities. So we're going to look at all of those kinds of things. We're going to look at the the critical importance of intellectual property and intellectual capital. Intellectual property is the result of the intellectual capital that you accumulate in many respects. But both of them have a connection, and they're always connected to people. Protecting your intellectual property and making sure that you get the maximum benefit out of it is way more than just simply filing patents and copyrights. It's a lot of process specific structure that you build into the company. Importantly is social capital and network capital. And we're not talking about Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn. We're talking about the interactions and how you structure your company to be able to encourage interactions between the different silos and organizational components of your company to be able to get the maximum value out of the creativity of your organization. So these are all parts of the intellectual capital, social capital, and network sort of capital aspects of a business. So these are the things in a general high level sense that we're going to talk about as we delve into the analysis and evaluation phase of strategy development. And then the next thing that we're going to look at is deciding and formulating. Deciding and formulating means coming up with a strategy, picking from the different strategic options that exist, and formulating a strategy that's going to be proper and effective for the unique situation which your company finds itself in. There are 5 or 6 different sort of strategy dynamics and levels. There's business level strategy, which typically relates to a specific industry. If your business doesn't have multiple different business units and cover different industries, then business level strategy is really pretty much going to cover it for you. If you're part of an organization that works in multiple industries, then the next sort of layer up is corporate level strategy, where you look at how to leverage synergies out of your organization. You look at things like forward and backwards integration and all that kind of stuff, and related and unrelated diversification and those kinds of things. International strategy takes the concept of strategy outside of the country, whether it's the United States or otherwise, but outside of the country and into a global context. We'll be looking at all the different kinds of strategies for entering global markets and evaluating the different kinds of qualifiers and metrics and situations and conditions that you're going to want to consider to determine what the best strategy for global expansion will be. This I found fascinating. I love international strategy. Entrepreneurial strategy is how you take the corporation that you have, the business that you've built, and develop and encourage a constant renewal of creativity within the organization. How do you get your managers to think like owners? How do you get your employees to take a vested personal interest in the success of the company? So entrepreneurial strategy is applicable at the corporate level. And then there's a really interesting segment or thought process related to competitive dynamics. And basically this means that every action has a equal or an opposite, kind of like physics, right? Equal and opposite reaction. Basically what I'm saying is when you do something in the competitive environment, your competitors are going to respond. Or maybe they're doing something and you have to respond. You know, I think of it in simplistic terms as the stuffed crust pizza and the square pizza. You know, the pizza market is incredibly competitive. And the different major companies that do a lot of advertising constantly try to come up with new ways to make a pizza sound different and better. I mean, how many ways can you come up with? Well, apparently quite a few. I remember, you know, square pizzas. I'm sure that, you know, there's still there's square pizzas. There's pizzas with thick crust, thin crust, deep dish. You know, there's Boston, there's New York, there's Detroit, there's Chicago. There's so many different kinds of pizza. Some of them really are different, and some of them really aren't. There's pizza with rolled crusts and with crusts that have cheese in them, and crusts that have, they're like cannellonis, or they have They have, pepperoni and meats inside the crust along with cheeses. I mean, pizza companies are constantly coming up with new ways to make their items sound better than any other pizza company. And if you're in the pizza business, you have to constantly be thinking about, if you launch something, what's going to be the competitive response? Because your competitors are going to respond. So competitive dynamics is a fascinating area of conversation and discussion, and we'll touch on that. We'll get into that. That takes care of kind of the general flow of decision and formulation step. Then you have implementation and actions. And this is where the rubber meets the roads. And so rubber meets the road. So here we're going to talk about a lot of things that are in that realm: strategic controls, corporate governance, organizational design and organizational structure, leadership dynamics, ethics, legal issues. We're going to talk about, again, corporate entrepreneurship and innovation. Corporate entrepreneurship, we kind of touched on. Entrepreneurial strategies, touch on that. But again, building an entrepreneurial organization is an important implementation process. And then innovation. Innovation is critical to today's world. You simply cannot survive as a business very long if you're not constantly figuring out new and better ways to offer products and services to the market. And so various innovation strategies and dynamics are, of course, part of the strategic process. I want to talk for just a moment about some of the sources of a competitive advantage. Now, this isn't the only time, or the deep dive, if you will, but there are a relatively concise number of things that are really directly traced or tracked to a competitive advantage, and upon which a competitive advantage is built. One is intellectual property. If you're a fan of Shark Tank, and I am, and I know many of you are, you know that one of the questions the sharks ask the very kind of right out of the gate, if they're interested. Now, if they're not interested, they won't ask this question. But if they're interested, they'll ask the question, well, do you have a utility patent on that? The reason they ask if you have a utility patent is because that's one of the best ways to actually build a competitive advantage. Presuming that the product that you have is patentable and that you can get a utility patent on it. That typically implies that your competitors are going to be locked out of doing what you do the way you do it. Now, that doesn't mean they can't figure an end-run way around what you do or how you do it and still compete with you. But it does mean that the way you compete physically has been protected by U.S. patent laws and gives you the right to protect through the legal system the head start advantage, the unique intellectual property that you have that gives you a better way of doing things. And so intellectual property is, of course, important. Building barriers to entry is also important. Can you build a barrier to entry that protects your position in the market? I could show you right now a software package that you could buy that would allow you to have a clone of Facebook. And you could, if you understand technology well enough, to implement it on a server with $1,000 or so of money to buy the software and a few dozen or 100 hours of your time, you could have a Facebook clone up and running. But simply being able to invest $1,000 and have a Facebook clone up and running doesn't give you the ability to compete with Facebook, because they've built an incredibly massive barrier to entry, which is the 1.5 or 2 billion, however many there are, people that are on Facebook. That's the asset value that they've built, and it makes it insurmountable for another company to compete directly with them. Even Google, with Google Plus, did not have the market strength to be able to compete in Facebook's arena, and they tried. So building barriers to entry, and there's lots of different ways you can do that. Having unique relationships. If you have unique supplier relationships where you have access to unique high quality or non-commodity, very specialized raw materials or resources, that can give you a competitive advantage. And of course, the people in your company, the human capital that you have is ultimately probably one of the biggest and best sources of a competitive advantage, because people are where intellectual property comes from. People are where the creativity and the innovation that drives opportunity, that's where they come from. So human capital is an important component. If you want to win, do the ordinary things better than anyone else does them, day in and day out. It's a great quote. And it really works in a lot of respects, but it's not enough. It's not enough in the world of business to build a sustainable competitive advantage. And the reason is because you're really talking about efficiency. And there's a difference between efficiency and effectiveness. There's the concept of ambidexterity. And ambidexterity means you have to be able to do two things at one time. And good managers, good strategists are able to do two things at one time. They're able to be efficient in the execution of the plan that's in place. But that's really nothing more than process improvement. And while I don't minimize process improvement, it is critical to sustaining a cost advantage and a quality advantage. Having a better process is a great thing to have, but that's just doing things right. Doing things right is doing them better. It's the Chuck Noll quote. Effectiveness is doing the right thing. A ditch digger that's the fastest and best ditch digger with a shovel that there ever has been can dig a ditch in a straight line, but if he doesn't dig the ditch from point A to point B like he should, he's not being effective. So effectiveness is where strategic thinking comes in, to make sure that while you're being efficient, you're also being efficient at the important things, the most effective things that you can be efficient at. And so it's important to make sure that you have both the ability to measure the management sort of normal things that you do and be efficient, but it's also important to think strategica so that you're always being as effective as you possibly can for the long term. Being efficient will not give you a competitive advantage, because ultimately being efficient is not something that you can do really, that you can lock your competitors out of. They can also be efficient. They can invest in Six Sigma and all that kind of stuff, and they can become as efficient as you. They can build a service organization that's as customer centric as you, if they have enough time. You may have a head start. You may have some benefits that they don't, but those kinds of things can be built around and can be surpassed. Especially if you don't constantly push the ball forward. So we're going to always focus on both efficiency and effectiveness as we explore the strategic realm and look deeper into each of the different things that we can look into. I'm going to pause for a second. I'm going to pop back over to comments. It looks like there's a couple of comments. Hi, Pat. Good to see you. Been a long time. Thank you for tuning in. Bob Hurt, good to see you. Thank you for tuning in. Hopefully, you have found this interesting. I doubt that there's anything brand new that I have covered today that is something that you don't already know. But I did need to set the sort of the direction of the next few weeks worth of conversation, the next few months worth of conversations. We're going to, again, cover strategy and competitive advantage building on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And on Mondays and Wednesdays, we're going to focus our attention on startups and basically rapid growth for small businesses. So please tune in each day of each week. Tomorrow, we're going to do an entrepreneur interview. Fridays are entrepreneur interview days. And so at 3 o'clock, I'll be interviewing a successful entrepreneur so that you can hear how and why they did what they did and why they did and whether they would do it any different, all that kind of stuff. And hopefully learn some things from them. And so if you haven't yet done so, I'm going to do a banner and I'm going to say, create here a live stream livestreamlee.com. Go to livestreamlee.com. And Pat, I saw you did that yesterday. Thank you. If anybody else is watching, whenever you're watching, go to livestreamlee.com and create an account. I will be posting documents and slide decks and things like that on livestreamlee.com in the community area, so that as we move along in time here, there will be a progressively richer library of supplemental materials. So that's where you need to go to get it. The account is free. Join the community, and you get a whole bunch of cool tools like CRMs and shopping carts and stuff like that, included for free. Thank you again for tuning in. And Pat and Bob, thank you for being here on the chat. I'll look forward to talking to you soon. Bye-bye.